I'd like to call the meeting of the Military Construction and Veterans Affairs Appropriations Subcommittee to order. As this hearing is fully virtual, I want to address a few housekeeping matters initially. For today's meeting, the chair or staff designated by the chair may mute participants' microphones when they are not under recognition for the purposes of eliminating inadvertent background noise. Members are responsible for muting and unmuting themselves. If I notice that you have not unmuted yourself, I will ask you if you'd like the staff to unmute you. If you indicate approval by nodding, staff will unmute your microphone. I remind all members and witnesses that the 5-minute clock still applies. If there is a technology issue, we will move to the next member until the issue is resolved, and you will retain the balance of your time. You will notice a clock on the bottom of your screen. For me, it's on the top of my screen, that will show how much time you have remaining. At 1 minute remaining, the clock will turn to yellow. When your time has expired, the clock will turn red and I will begin to recognize the next member. I generally provide a little more flexibility if that's possible given this format. We'll certainly continue that practice, but we'll just see how it goes. In terms of the speaking order, we will follow the order set forth in the House rules, beginning with the chair and ranking member. Then members present at the time the hearing is called to order will be recognized in order of seniority, alternating between majority and minority, and finally, members not present at the time of the hearing is called to order. Finally, House rules require me to remind you that we have set up an email address to which members can send anything they wish to submit in writing at any of our hearings or markups. That email address has been provided in advance to your staff. And I will again remind all members that in order for this to work, if you are present at the hearing now, please turn on your camera. Okay. Today, we welcome a representative from the Office of the Secretary of Defense, Mr. Paul Kramer, and Ms. Elizabeth Fields from GAO. The focus of this hearing is to have the witnesses provide an update on the Department of Defense's efforts to fully assess the extent and nature of the troubling and persistent issues within the privatized military family housing program. In addition, they will provide details on their ongoing actions to remedy the inadequate oversight of the program and their long-term plan to make permanent positive changes to that program. To remind members and also to inform our newer members to the subcommittee, in August of 2018, Reuters published the first in a series of damning articles chronicling health and safety issues experienced by military families living in privatized military family housing. These articles prompted an ever-increasing number of military families from across the country to come forward with their experiences. The large, geographically diverse group of families indicated that there were systemic failures in the privatized military family housing program, and we had an opportunity as a subcommittee to visit some of the privatized military family housing, and I can certainly confirm, having seen it with my own eyes, some of the really appalling and unacceptable conditions that families in the military have had to live with, and the really serious deficit in the response, not only from the military, but from the companies that are running the privatized military family housing as well. Families of all services, ranks, and pay grades have reported health problems related to lead and mold exposure, rodent infestations, rude and dismissive housing management, and ineffective oversight of the program by the services, which the services acknowledged in our hearing last year. The witnesses today will present findings on how the Department of Defense has improved its processes, the continued way forward, and what still needs to be rectified. Many of the problems experienced by military families appear to be products of poor management by private partners and insufficient or ineffective oversight by military services. Many military families have complained about the maintenance support they have received from the private companies as well. The services report that a lack of visibility on work order processing has contributed to the overall lack of oversight. In addition, the current system incentivizes work order completion without respect to the quality of maintenance performed, which has led to poor workmanship and unqualified personnel performing the work. That's also something that came to light when we visited bases with privatized military family housing as well. An overemphasis on occupancy rates incentivizes quick turnover of homes, which in turn can lead to a lack of preventative maintenance of homes between tenants. Obviously, we don't want to just jam people into homes when we're turning them over without making sure that identified problems that came up with the previous tenant are addressed before we move someone in only to experience the same ongoing problems. While DoD has taken key steps to strengthen oversight, more action is clearly still needed. There will be some insight from Ms. Field on how extreme weather has a financial impact on housing during this hearing, and I'm looking forward to a good conversation and learning what has been accomplished over the last year. Our ranking member, Judge Carter, is unable to join us today because of power outages as a result of the winter storm. Standing in as ranking member today is Congressman Tony Gonzalez, a new member of the committee, but one whose expertise we will benefit from as a veteran and as someone who lived in privatized military housing during his service. And normally, Mr. Gonzalez, I would love to take the opportunity to haze you, since this is the first chance we're having to have you help manage the meeting and serve as ranking member. And freshman hazing is something that we really enjoy doing, but you get off easy because we're doing this virtually. But I'll put a pin in that for later on when we're back in person. So Mr. Gonzalez, thank you for arranging your schedule to be with us for the entire hearing and for stepping into this role today. Look forward to working with you on tackling these problems, and you are recognized for 5 minutes for your opening statement.
Well, thank you, Madam Chairman, and I'm sure there'll be plenty of opportunities for hazing to come this way. Yeah, as you mentioned, Judge Carter isn't able to make it today. He got caught up in Snowmageddon, but here I am. So first off, good morning, everyone. I thank the chairwoman for yielding me time and for kicking off our oversight hearing this year. This is the first hearing that will allow us to dig into important issues that the committee focused on last year and to determine if more needs to be done. Safe and adequate military family housing is a pillar of a capable and ready force. I don't want our soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines to be less effective when deployed because they're worried about their homes and their families. Deployment is tough enough for everyone without this added worry. From a personal standpoint, having spent 20 years in the military, I've lived in amazing privatized housing and not so amazing privatized housing. And I can tell you that the amazing housing was far more better for everyone involved. I look forward to hearing the witnesses' perspectives on the changes and improvements to military family housing over the past year and their suggestions for the years ahead. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you so much, Mr. Gonzalez. I don't see Ms. Granger or Ms. DeLauro here with us. They are ex officio members of the subcommittee. And so moving on, Mr. Kramer, we appreciate you joining us this morning. Your full written testimony will be included in the record, and you are recognized to summarize your statement for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. So I'll appreciate including my statement in the record. I would like to start my opening remarks by thanking you, Madam Chairwoman, and Ranking Member Gonzalez and others distinguished members of the subcommittee that are here today. And I appreciate the opportunity to discuss military housing privatization initiative. I would like to begin by acknowledging the subcommittee's support of our efforts to improve the quality of life for military members, their families, and your efforts to enhance the MHPI program. This committee's support provides the department the resources needed to fulfill our commitment to ensure housing privatization projects provide safe, quality, well-maintained housing where our military members and their families will want and choose to live. The military departments have leveraged the appropriations to increase their oversight by hiring more than 500 additional employees in the military housing offices. These additional people provide quality assurance, customer care services, and advocacy for the residents. Since the March 3rd, 2020 MHPI hearing before this subcommittee, the department has made significant progress implementing MHPI reforms set out in the FY 2020 and 2021 NDAAs. We have worked to develop department-wide privatization housing policies to reinforce and expand our programmatic oversight over MHPI housing projects with a focus on 5 key aspects that include senior leader engagement to collaborate internally and with MHPI companies on housing issues and necessary corrective actions, rebuilding trust with military members and their families, accountability at all levels within the Department of Defense by MHPI companies to perform our oversight as originally intended at the outset of the housing privatization initiative, transparency and more frequent communication with MHPI tenants, and ensuring the long-term financial viability of the MHPA projects and the program writ large. We have previously discussed the privatization companies who own and operate MHPA privatized housing projects are neither DoD nor military department contractors, and the MHPI projects are not contracts governed by traditional federal acquisition regulations. This means that the government does not have the legal authority to unilaterally change the terms of existing MHPI housing project legal agreements. That is not an excuse, but an explanation that we must continue to work collaboratively with our 14 distinct project owners who represent 81 separate project companies to retroactively implement common or universal policies and provisions to existing MHPI housing projects. We have prioritized our efforts on actions that will improve the tenant experience, rebuild tenant trust, and maintain MHPI housing projects' financial viability. Our initial phase has been focused on implementing the MHPI Tenant Bill of Rights and the NDA requirements embedded in those rights as a visible commitment to military members and their families. Based on our efforts to date, 14 of the 18 tenant rights set out in the 2020 NDA are available to all tenants at existing MHPI housing projects. In addition, the department has issued all of the policy guidance necessary to fully implement the remaining 4 tenant rights at all MHPI housing projects, but retroactive application of these remaining requirements at existing projects will require voluntary agreement by the retrospective MHPI companies. We expect the remaining 4 tenant rights to be available at the vast majority of installations with MHPI housing by June 1st, 2020. This represents a fundamental step in our ongoing effort to improve the department's military housing program. Our next step will focus on those provisions intended to improve the safety, quality, habitability of family housing, and the monitoring and continued enforcement of performance standards established for the MHPI companies. This includes developing guidance for the various inspections and housing standard requirements and establishing policies and procedures for health hazard assessments and mitigation. These requirements have and will continue to take time to craft and implement guidance as they necessitate bringing together a range of expertise. The Department of Defense is committed to working closely with you, the committee staff, to ensure our military members and their families who choose to reside in MHPA housing have safe, quality homes and a positive living experience. Thank you for the opportunity to testify on this very important topic and for your continued support of the priorities of the department to improve the quality of life of our military members and family members who are called to sacrifice so much for us.
Okay, I'll try that again. Thank you, Mr. Kramer. Now I'd like to call upon Elizabeth Field from GAO. Your full statement has been entered into the record, and you are recognized to summarize your statement for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Chairwoman Wasserman Schultz, Ranking Member Gonzalez, and members and staff of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting me to testify on GAO's work assessing the Military Housing Privatization Initiative, or MHPI. As you know, it has been almost 1 year since I last testified before this subcommittee on the same topic. I believe that the update I provide today is a reflection of the value that robust and sustained oversight attention from Congress can have on government programs. So I also want to thank you for your continued attention to these important issues. Last year, GAO published a report in which we identified notable weaknesses in DoD's management and oversight of MHPI. The military services efforts to monitor the quality and condition of privatized housing and to hold the private developers accountable for their performance were generally inadequate. The Office of the Secretary of Defense's oversight of the military services was likewise limited, and the information that DoD provided to Congress about the program was less than transparent. We made 12 recommendations to address the problems we found, and I'm pleased to report that as of today, DoD has either fully or partially implemented all of our recommendations and expects to complete the remaining work needed to implement them this year. Some of the key actions that the department has taken include instituting standardized quarterly reviews of the military department's privatized housing portfolios with a focus on quality and condition, developing a process for collecting and calculating resident satisfaction data to ensure that these data are more accurate and consistently used, and establishing criteria for monitoring the financial viability of privatized housing projects and assessing risk. DoD has also taken steps, as Mr. Kramer noted, in response to congressional requirements, such as issuing a tenant's bill of rights, developing a common lease agreement, and piloting an effort to provide tenants with 7 years of their unit's maintenance history. Many of these efforts are still ongoing, as the department must negotiate with the private developers to fully implement some of them. Nonetheless, these actions are undoubtedly a positive step toward further strengthening DoD's oversight of the condition of privatized housing. MHPI, however, is a large and exceedingly complex program. And as Mr. Kramer notes in his written statement, DoD's oversight of the program has not been up to established standards. Significant concerns went unaddressed for an unacceptable period of time. So it is perhaps not surprising that in examining other aspects of MHPI, we have again found areas where the department could improve. First, in a review of the insurance carried by 3 privatized housing projects impacted by severe weather events, we found that the military departments have not exercised sufficient oversight of their project's insurance coverage. For example, the Navy has not documented its insurance reviews, and the Army has not done them on a regular basis. At one location we reviewed, the Army had not even done a complete insurance review since 2005. And just as we found last year, we determined that the Office of the Secretary of Defense has not been doing enough to monitor the military departments, in this case to ensure that they were meeting the insurance requirements for their projects. We also recently issued a report on the basic allowance for housing, a key source of revenue for privatized housing projects. We found that while the department has generally followed and developed a data-intensive process for setting housing allowances, it has not always collected data on the minimum number of rental units needed to estimate the total housing cost for certain locations and certain housing types. By not meeting its sample size targets, DoD risks providing housing compensation that does not accurately represent the cost of suitable housing. We also found that some privatized projects were disproportionately hurt by congressionally authorized reductions in the basic allowance for housing because of differences in how subsidies to offset those reductions were calculated. That is a problem that only Congress can fix, and we have offered a matter for congressional consideration to do just that. In closing, I believe it is fair to say that over the last year, the department has made real progress in addressing the problems we and others have identified. And I am encouraged that for the most part, the department has concurred with the recommendations in our most recent reports and has begun taking steps to address them. But given the significance of MHPI to the department's commitment to provide safe, adequate housing to service members and their families, sustained attention will be warranted for many years to come. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Ms. Field. Appreciate your assisting us with oversight of this important program, particularly to the quality of life of the members of our armed forces and their families. So we will thank you both for your remarks. We'll proceed in the standard 5-minute rounds, recognizing members in order of seniority as they were seated at the beginning of the hearing, alternating between majority and minority. Please be mindful of your time and allow the witnesses to answer within your 5-minute turn. I'll begin. I have a number of questions, and so I would anticipate that we would have at least a couple of rounds of questions, because we each won't get through them in our 5 minutes. It's a little tough for me to know which question to ask first, just because this is very much a chicken and an egg situation. But the key thing that we identified in the oversight hearing we conducted previously is that there was woefully inadequate oversight. There was really no oversight from the military of this key program. And Mr. Kramer, we've funded you for the last couple of years at a considerable amount of money. I believe about $135 million and then $60 million in the last 2 fiscal years. But can you provide the subcommittee with a manning update? Because it appears that you have not been able to staff up quickly enough to actually make sure that there is appropriate oversight in place. And so what can we do to help you address the manning shortfalls that you're experiencing that have contributed to the lack of oversight of this program? Is it funding? Is it what is the challenge you're facing? And where are you on manning this important oversight provision?
So thank you for that question. Yeah, so manning wise, I think while we're still doing manpower reviews as was dictated in the NDAA. So military departments are going through the manning reviews. To date, we have hired over 500 employees at the garrison installation level to conduct that oversight. Continued funding is important so that we don't end up with term employees, if you will. So we want permanent employees that have a long-term vested interest in remaining as part of the military department's workforce. And then once we train them up,
and thanks to all of you for inviting me to join you today. As you heard,
I think someone is not on mute. Thank you. You can proceed.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, and so those employees are doing those activities that we quite frankly were not doing as a department prior to 2018. The activities of language, we did not put emphasis at the garrison housing offices and the installation housing offices that we have today. So they're doing between occupancy, maintenance, inspections. So we're seeing positive returns on those investments that we put into those employees. So this last summer and in the Army's case in the summer of 2019, they were already doing between occupancies. It increases that move-in process, if you will, and they're also being advocates for the families that quite frankly may not have received a quality move-in experience and have some issues with the housing that they just can't get those issues resolved between themselves and the property manager and their maintenance staff. So we're doing increased advocacy that we're starting to see dividends. So Congresswoman, I think continued funding is at the same level we're at today is appropriate. The other items that are being undertaken, the Army is doing a pilot at Fort Belvoir to inspect all housing to a standard, and that's going to inform us as the direction we go. So the standard they're using at Fort Belvoir here in Virginia is the code that exists in Fairfax County and in the Commonwealth. We use that as an inspection standard to go through and identify where there are issues with maintenance deficiencies. Are there structural issues with the home? So we're going to set a baseline, and the pilot at Belvoir will inform us as we go forward. The other thing we've done is train the new employees on what the expectations are within the department. So we have consistency across all the military departments. So, over.
Okay. One of the things that I heard and the subcommittee members heard when we were on the ground in several different locations, as well as in testimony from families, is that a common failing across all of the services has essentially been indifferent or non-existent command involvement in housing management at the installation level. So your answer included that you've hired 500 oversight staff at the garrison level. Quite frankly, we heard a lot about those types of employees being housed in the same location as staff from the privatized companies, from the private companies that manage the housing. And thus, when a member of the military in that housing had a complaint, they had to walk into the same room, essentially, or office, where they, it's a little more uncomfortable to complain about something when the person you're complaining about is sitting right there. So what has been done to ensure, A, that installation commanders are informed, that they're empowered to act, that they're motivated to intervene on behalf of military families? Because frankly, the other things that we heard from those family members is that, it just was not a priority for military leadership in the chain of command that was responsible for that housing on these bases. They just really had a lot of other stuff to do, and they in particular weren't very responsive. They were buddy-buddy with the people in the privatized companies because they shared the same office with them, and they didn't really get a whole lot of action when there was a complaint. So what steps have been taken to make very serious changes so that those problems are eliminated?
Thank you. That's an excellent question, because we in the military departments also had we had languished into a set of a partnership where there was mutual holding of accountability on each side. We ended up with more of a friendship agreement, and that existed across the board on a lot of them. And with friendships, you're right. They then tend to cover one another. So we're now improving back to a partnership agreement. The offices have been separated out. In some cases, we've relocated the military housing, that being the DoD employees, in a separate building from the privatized housing entity. So, in the case where there's no facilities, we've created a firewall, if you will. So there's separate doors, so they're not, in essence, sharing an office space. We've implemented those across the board. Senior leaders are involved in all the military departments. They've done town halls, and some of the military departments, those are still occurring today on a quarterly basis, where they get the commanding general. Even with COVID, they've done virtual town halls, and some of the senior commanders, that being the general officers, are doing what they're referring to as walking town halls. They will then go out and walk those neighborhoods and go door to door and talk to the community to understand their concerns, and then have the team with them to actually action those items that are discovered. So that we've made headways. Not saying that we're at victory stage, but we are reinstilling at echelon that the government has an oversight role, and we are implementing that oversight role in the property management aspects of the privatization agreements. Over.
Okay, before I turn it over, and I appreciate the comprehensive response, before I turn it over to Mr. Gonzalez, I just want to underscore how important it is that these installation commanders, that the people who are responsible in their job description for the oversight at the installation level actually give two hoots about the quality of life of their military personnel in this privatized housing. Because I can tell you that both from testimony in our hearing as well as on the ground feedback, a lot of these folks felt like their entreaties to their chain of command fell on deaf ears. Has that been communicated? Mr. Kramer? I can't hear him if he's talking.
Yeah, I can't hear him as well.
Mr. Kramer, we can't hear you. You're on mute now, but we couldn't hear you when you weren't on mute. Brad, can we unmute Mr. Kramer? You have an audio problem, Mr. Kramer, it appears. If you're talking, we can't hear you. Okay, this will be pretty important for Mr. Kramer's audio to work, because he's the one that we primarily need to get answers from. So. Still can't hear you. You're unmuted, Mr. Kramer. Well, no, you're not, but sorry, we're experiencing technical difficulties. Please stand by. I would move on, but I assume that Mr. Gonzalez has a question for Mr. Kramer, so.
No, we need to.
Yeah. Mr. Kramer, you're going to need to call in from your phone, my staff is telling me. So if you're having an audio problem, you should dial the number that you were sent that will access this meeting so that you can use the volume there, and then we can still see you on video. Are you able to dial in? Okay. Sarah, you may, well, yeah. Do you need the number, Mr. Kramer? You can nod your head because I can see you. I don't even know whether he can hear me. Can you hear me? Mr. Kramer, give me a thumbs up if you can hear me. I don't think he can hear me. Okay, yeah, he definitely will have to call in because he's standing by. He's lost audio. He's standing by. Okay. We sent you a. Why don't you guys just give me this phone number and I will put it in the chat, or put the phone number in the chat for him, please. Yeah, Mr. Kramer, yeah, I don't know why, I guess I'm gonna give up talking to him. All right, we're trying to get his audio difficulties worked out. It doesn't look like he's on his cell phone, you guys. To inform the members, Mr. Bishop has a 12 o'clock meeting briefing that he'll be chairing in the Ag Subcommittee. So if we get close to when he has to jump off, I'm going to have him be the next Democrat. And then we will go back to the order.
Thank you, Madam.
Oh, you're welcome, Mr. Bishop. And Mr. Gonzalez, you'll still be next when we get this straightened out.
Okay, no problem.
Everybody else can hear, right? And everybody else's audio works? Okay. Just making sure. Mr. Gonzalez, why don't we recognize you for your questions for Ms. for Ms. Field, since she has audio, and then we can at least proceed, and then we can come back to Mr. Kramer in the next round.
Yeah.
Okay, does that work? You're
Yeah.
recognized for 5 minutes.
All right, thank you, Madam Chairwoman. So, Ms. Field, the question I have is, in your testimony, you highlighted DOD implemented GAO's recommendation to update guidance on oversight. In November 2019, DOD required each military department to take steps to better monitor work order completion. You shared some of that during the initial standpoint, during your initial testimony, but can you drill down a little bit deeper on what specific results have occurred?
Sure, thank you. And let me first check to make sure you can hear me.
Yes, I can hear you.
Great. Yes, well, thank you for that question, Ranking Member Gonzalez. Let me first start by offering why we had recommended that in the first place. All of the privatized housing developers are required under the terms of their agreements to maintain work order data about any call that a resident calls in with a problem in their unit. When all of the problems started rising to the surface with privatized housing about a year or two ago, the military departments realized that they had this potential source of data on their hands to see how things were going by looking at the work order data. We at GAO also sought to use those data to see what was going on. In fact, we collected over 8 million work order data records from the private developers to see what we could learn from them. The problem is that the data related to the work orders were not reliable at all. There were duplicate records, there were work orders, records that were in the system that showed being completed before they had even been submitted. So there were big problems. And so because the military departments wanted to use the work order data to try to assess the privatized housing developers' performance, we recommended that they come up with the system, the one that you just referenced. The department has made strides since then. They have, for example, required that the military departments have a system in place for collecting and monitoring the work order data on a routine basis, and all of that is good. But I will note that we haven't yet closed out this recommendation as fully implemented, in part because we are not yet sure, and Mr. Kramer, if he has audio, might be able to clarify this. We're not sure that all of the military departments at all of the projects have complete access to 100% of the work order data and the systems themselves so that they can fully assess that. And so for that reason and a few others, we don't consider this to be fully implemented yet. I hope that answers your question.
I believe Mr. Kramer has access to audio now, Mr. Gonzalez, if you want him to respond.
Okay, great. Great. I'll move on to the next question just so we can keep it going. The question I have for Mr. Kramer, it follows along the lines of what the chairwoman kind of alluded to at the beginning, which is essentially, these families, these military families, feel as if they're not heard, as if they don't have a means to communicate their issues to their chain of command. And it's very frustrating. I've been on both ends of that, where it's very frustrating for those in that area. So, in my district, Laughlin Air Force Base is in Del Rio, and I recently visited it and spoke with the base commander, and they implemented a housing privatization advocate. So a member, a family, or a military family member is an advocate that the base commander can kind of communicate with. And so my question to you is, Mr. Kramer, what is your thoughts on having these advocates? They're not essentially paid employees, but they're there to advocate for to the highest levels. What is your thoughts on those that position and implementing that kind of across the department?
Question. In fact, we believe that an advocate is crucial to the success of not just privatization housing, but also where we still have government-owned housing. We want the advocate to speak on behalf of the residents, and it's something that while I was cut off before, we are putting back in place with the additional funding, and so I can't sit here today and guarantee that we have advocacies across the entire Department of Defense, but it is a priority that we've placed on it, and I know that the military departments are moving out to hire those, and the other secondary program that has been put in place by a number of installations and garrisons is what we refer to as a mayoral program. Back in, you may remember, and if you lived in owned housing, is we always assigned the senior ranking person in the neighborhood your responsibility to be a mayor, if you will. You know, and it's not a glamorous position, but it's very important. That's the interface between the garrison staff and the residents in the housing areas, so that you bring those issues up to light. And we've implemented that in a number of places, also on privatized housing. So it's not just an Army-owned, and then they're the ones that a second means to go back in and make sure the garrison, the installation commanders, and the senior folks there are aware of some of the issues that exist in the housing. As a backup advocacy program for them. Over.
Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Gonzalez. Since it's 11:44 and I know Mr. Bishop has to hop over to his meeting a little bit early, Mr. Bishop, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairman. Thank you so much for your courtesies, and to the other members. To Mr. Kramer and Ms. Field, thank you so much for your testimony, for being here. As a former ranking member of the subcommittee and the current co-chair of the Congressional Military Family Caucus, military housing for families is definitely a very top priority for me. And as we know, the housing crisis isn't going to fix itself overnight, and service members and families are going to want to ensure that the issue remains in focus. Of course, you know, from mold and lead paint issues, substandard care and diligence from the housing, lack of diligence from the housing providers. What is the biggest change that you've implemented to show that you're giving due concern to the service members? And do you believe that there should be more input or more power given to the installation command teams so that they would have a stronger ability to influence private housing companies? And if the tenants, for example, were allowed to withhold their housing payments in light of an incident, what effects do you think this would have on promoting a quicker response and better response from the providers?
Congressman, those are great questions, and also it's things that we have learned in the last 2 years, and I'll carry on where Ms. Fields had ended on the work order. So we have now implemented across the department policy where the work order systems are through an app online, and then the work orders are not closed out until the family member or the service member that called in the work order has acknowledged that the work was completed. And those are being implemented across the board. I think we are all but 1 or 2 installations that are up and running on that work order system. And so that then has positive effect on the family members, because they are now part of that system where they call in work, they're there when the work is being done, and then they have some part to play in the completion of that work. And we've also implemented a system much like Yelp. You know, a scale of 1 to 5, you rate that work that was performed, and then, so those are positive feedbacks that we get from the family members going forward, and the score, if you will, no longer gets filtered through the private company. They now go directly to the housing manager staff, and then it's visible by the garrison commander on a routine, regular basis. And so we are now, as part of that data, we own the data as a department, and then the senior leaders look at that. The other powerful thing that we've done to hold the property managers accountable is we've implemented, as part of the NDAA, one of the rights was the ability to withhold rent. And then so we've tied that back to performance of the property manager in the lease, and then we've set up a dispute resolution process where the commanders are the first line, and we're referring to that as an informal process. So the commanders at the colonel level are the informal deciders of the dispute resolution. If the issues aren't resolved there, then we've implemented a formal dispute process. That's where we are now going to go back in, where you've got a general officer, if you will, or a flag officer, the deciding official in the formal disputes, those that can't get resolved below. And that's currently where we're at in getting the private partners to retroactively agree to that, to apply to the existing project companies. And so they're going through the legal reviews, the state reviews, and we anticipate all but a handful will agree to implement that dispute rent withholding clauses by this summer. Over.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kramer. Ms. Field, any quick comments?
Well, I would just note that those are absolutely positive steps. They are consistent with many of the recommendations that we made. And I think one of the key challenges here is exactly what Mr. Kramer just noted, which is that they can't all be unilaterally done. And there are some privatized housing developers that have been holdouts on some of these important measures.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairman. Thank you to Mr. Kramer and Ms. Field, and thank you to the committee members for your courtesy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You're welcome, no problem, and take good care of the ag folks. Okay, next up is Mr. Valadeo. You're recognized for 5 minutes. Mr. Valadeo, you're on mute.
I think that's better, right? Is that better?
Yes.
Oh, perfect. Thank you, Chairwoman Wasserman Schultz. I appreciate the opportunity. Mr. Kramer, my district is a proud home of Naval Air Station Lemoore, where over 9,000 service members, civilian personnel, and their families support the Navy's Master Training Center for the carrier-based strike fighter squadrons of the Pacific Fleet. Due to the low cost of living in the Central Valley, a large number of Lemoore personnel live in nearby communities. But many families also live in about 1,600 privately managed on-base houses. Despite the reforms Congress has passed to improve on-base housing, I'm concerned that housing resources might not be evenly distributed between low-cost living areas like Lemoore and other high-cost areas like San Francisco. Since private housing providers are paid rent equal to the base's allowance for housing, what is the department doing to ensure that housing providers are investing as much in low housing allowance areas as they are in high housing allowance areas? And we need to make sure that the key bases like Naval Air Station Lemoore have high quality house for high quality men and women who work there.
Thank you, Congressman. Yeah, so we are concerned with the, I don't know if it's I would refer to it as an unequal distribution of the BAH and rent. Each one of these is a standalone company. I'm not overly familiar with Lemoore's BAH, and before I get way out over my ski tips, I would like to take a deeper dive and look at that, and then provide a more comprehensive answer to you, and I'll be glad to do that on a separate call. But on a separate note, one of the clauses within the NDA referred to as Section 606 is the BAH payback. And so prior to NDA 2020, that was just kind of it would go back to those installations that generated the rents and the BAH, and they would get the 5% back. We are now this year going to write the policy that allows the military departments, where if you have a situation as you'd explained in Lemoore, where the rental income is less than's needed to provide safe and habitable property management, then the policy is going to envision that the not all of that Section 606 payment, BAH payback, would go to each one of the installations, and military departments would be actually allowed to and able to pool that. It's a 2.5% of a 5%, and put it towards the most needed installations. And so Lemoore, in this case, if it didn't have enough BAH rental in order to provide safe and habitable homes. The Navy in this case would be able to increase that Section 606 payback. Over.
All right. Well, I appreciate the answer. Some of my other questions have already been asked, so I'll yield back the rest of my time. Thank you.
Okay, thanks so much, Mr. Valadeo. And now, Mr. Case, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Good morning, all. Coming to you from Hawaii, where it's very early but no snow, so I'll take the sunrise over the snow. And along those lines, Mr. Kramer, I have, of course, a major military presence here in Hawaii. I've got well over 100,000 military service members and family members here, 17,000 plus privatized housing units across all services. And so I've had a little bit of a microcosm of this in the last couple of years, although not as severe as the rest of the country. So in that context, you know, we're talking here about privatized housing and some of the processes for getting to complaints. And privatized housing issues are, of course, about quality of life, but they're about health also. I mean, that at the very basic level, they're about the health of the folks living in those units, and that's where the most troubling reports have been from lead-based paint or molded infestation, et cetera. There were inventories charged to the services in the 2019-2020 time frame where basically DoD asked all of the services to go out there and actually inventory their units. This is a little bit of my subjective impression, but those were in some cases inconsistent in terms of which services did how broadly they inventoried, how broadly they reached out to their members. And nonetheless, the reports back gave a pretty clear picture of where some of the major issues were and where the follow-up needed to occur. And so my question is there now a regular process? And I'm not so much talking about the annual inventory of how the tenants feel. I'm talking about the services going in and following up with inspections of the units. So that you're not relying on, necessarily on what the tenants say, although that's an important thing to rely on, but you're not also relying on what the private companies say is or isn't the issue, but you are actually independently verifying whether some of these significant potential health concerns are in fact concerns, and if so, requiring the companies to replace them as opposed to kind of leaving it to the company's judgment. Where is that independent oversight on the actual health concerns arising out of the operation of the privatized housing program?
Congressman, that's you were spot on. Yeah. So the summer of 2019, the Secretary of Defense and directed all the service secretaries and their senior leaders to go out and inspect all homes, and so that was done. Those actions then turned into immediate work orders to correct the deficiencies that are found, and then all the military departments then turned, instead of that one-time inspection, they turned it into a series of inspections. One of the Army in this case probably led the effort, was that we overwhelmed the new tenants at sign-in. So we give them a book and said, here's your house, here's where everything we found wrong. If you see anything, come back and tell us. In a lot of cases, that would never turn into actionable items. And so each one of the military departments now will go in at a 30-day after lease signing. That was an NDA clause, and so it's not a sign your lease and then call me if you have issues. And so it's now the military departments are proactive in going out to the houses to say, all right, knock on the door, do you have any issues, and they'll get those tracked in. The other thing that we've done is implemented an annual inspection requirement. And so you have a face-to-face. Some families may not let you in the house, but we're going and knocking on doors and saying, hey, it's been a year since we last talked. Maybe you've done work orders, maybe you haven't. And then you have that dialogue between the military housing office, the government side, and the residents to have that dialogue back and say, are there issues with your housing or not? So in the cases we have now increased the dialogue and making that a routine part of the process of living in family housing. Because we have some residents that that don't PCS very often, and they're in their 5-6 years, and they may not have called in any work orders. So the problems in the houses don't become really known until there's a catastrophic event. So we're trying to prevent that through the ongoing dialogue that occurs with the families. Over.
Thank you very much. I'll defer further questions as my time's up.
Thanks, Mr. Case. We're going to, with agreement with Mr. Gonzalez, complete the remaining Democrat that to ask our questions, and then we'll resume the alternating party order. Ms. Lee, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Kramer, I wanted to take a minute to talk about the Bill of Rights. As of today, there's still 4 outstanding rights that need to be addressed. The process for dispute resolution, the withholding of rent until the disputes are resolved, the expectation of common documents, forms and processes, and access to maintenance history. I'd like to just clarify a couple things that you said in your testimony. You stated, quote, based on our continued collaboration with private companies, we expect that the vast majority will voluntarily agree to move forward towards implementation of these remaining rights. Is the DoD signing new contracts with these additions, or is this just a verbal agreement?
So our intent is not to sign new agreements with the existing project owners, and so what we're required to do by NDAA is establish those policies and procedures for new or renewed projects. And so, if you will, an existing project company wants to, exercise their ground lease or add new land, that is a new or renewed. And so we've issued now policies on the 18 rights that are envisioned in the Bill of Rights. So the partners, the project owners, if you will, if they have to exercise or new or renew, have to adopt the policies that we've put into place. So step one was we've now established for new or renewed the policies that would put into place the 18 Bill of Rights. And so we've also been asked as part of the NDA is to seek agreement on existing projects to adopt the 18 rights that were envisioned in the Bill of Rights. And so we've worked collaboratively. It's been a back and forth dialogue, and we issued policies on all of the rights, and we're going to update the 7-year maintenance history based on a change in the 2021, and I actually will sign that today. So we would have issued policies for all of the 18 to the existing project companies, and ask them to adopt them on their retroactive to their current projects. We've gotten agreement from all but 3 companies to do that, and I can provide the committee staff with where we're at with there, and I think we'll eventually get them all on board. And we've asked them to have those rights available for existing projects by the 1st of June in this summer's PCS season. Over.
Great. So just a clarification, you asked for agreement. Is this written agreement or is this a verbal with these existing properties or existing projects?
So it'll end in both. So we've asked them to verbally come back and tell us, and that's all we need to implement an existing. So the 14 of the 18 were already in existing agreements, either in the operating agreement, the property management agreement. There was some document that you could track back and go, those 14 of the 18 were already known. The last 3 are going to be rolled up into the landlord-tenant lease. And so within the landlord-tenant lease, when the new resident comes in and signs that, they will then have the dispute resolution, the rent withholding, and the 7-year maintenance will be included as part of that move-in, move-out process. So we will not issue guidance or modify agreements with the project owners. We'll embed those in existing documents that are then signed by the landlord and the tenant, and then oversaw by the military department. Over.
So you're confident that the department will have recourse should they not comply?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
And our ultimate recourse is back to the existing operating agreement.
Okay, that's all I have. Thank you. I yield.
Thank you, Ms. Lee. Okay, moving back to the order, Mr. Gonzalez will resume switching back and forth, so you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Okay, great. I'd like, we've covered a lot of territory, but I'd like to get into some of the nuts and bolts of where we're at. The chairwoman mentioned earlier that this subcommittee has provided right around $200 million of support for oversight. And my question, earlier you talked about, hiring maybe around 500, what sounded like maybe temporary employees. So my question is, one, how many employees do you hope to get to? That's one. And then the second is, how much funding do you expect you need in fiscal year 22?
So we're doing manpower studies to get the final number of employees. So far, we've hired about 500. And they're permanent employees. My comment was we don't want them to be temporary employees, so we need a continuous stream of funding in order to keep those folks on board past this next couple of years. Over.
What is that amount? What did you expect to either maintain or that you're asking for?
We think I'm sorry. So we believe we're probably in the $120 million range on an annual consistent basis. We have some spikes that we're trying to do within the military departments to inspect homes. It all comes out of that same account. But for the manpower, we think about 120 million consistent funding would be the right resource in order to have permanent, consistent oversight over.
Okay. My next question is, we had talked about kind of what has various different organizations done, and we feel as if we're moving in the right direction. But my question is, have y'all gone out to a survey or done anything with the military family members? Because at the end of the day, it's going to be, what do they think? What are their thoughts? Do they feel as if things are improving or not? And if so, do you have any empirical data that supports that?
So you say we as a department did not consistently conduct satisfaction surveys. As part of the NDA, we are now, we have a one uniform satisfaction survey. We went out this year, the first uniform application of that. So all of the military departments, while they went out individually, have the same questions seeking feedback from the current tenants. We do not have the results back. We believe in just by the number of respondents so far that the satisfaction will be kind of where we were last year, which is a positive because there wasn't a decline. I think we've stabilized, and then we'll be able to get some good feedback to improve the property management's performance on the housing companies. And when we get the final results from the survey companies, we'll make sure we share that with you, Congressman, and the committee staff. Over.
Great, thank you. And I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Gonzalez. Ms. Kramer, what the question that Mr. Gonzalez just asked and some of your testimony here about the 500 temporary staffers that you've hired for oversight, obviously needing more permanence than you have, begs the question, would it help to have a headquarters level adjutant or other staff position who can augment the Inspector General's office in investigating housing concerns? I know I envisioned initially when we went through this process that there would be someone at that level whose job description would include oversight from the DoD perspective. So what are your plans as far as that?
So from the Department of Defense perspective, we've established in the last year the chief housing officer, as was directed by the NDAA. So those sets of duties, while I'm currently designated as the department's chief housing officer because I perform the duties.
Let me just interrupt you there for a second, because you're doing two jobs, and
check.
That's problematic. The idea was that one person would be responsible for being the director of housing.
So, yeah, so
the chief housing officer duties will be with the Senate confirmed Assistant Secretary of Defense. What we in the Department of Defense have done is also in the last 6 months, 9 months now, have established a separate senior executive service member, Tier 2 SES, is performing the roles of the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense strictly for housing. Their sole duties of that Tier 2 SES is to oversee housing writ large within the Department of Defense, privatized, Army-owned, or excuse me, military department-owned, and then leased housing across the board, to include unaccompanied housing. So at the department level, we have one senior housing person at the DASD level. Below that, I think we've empowered, and we're seeing positive results by empowering, having the general officers and the installation and garrison commanders proactively involved in housing through town hall and their sensing sessions, listening sessions, and they are all then reporting back up through a 4-star to the respective military departments. So I think we've increased the oversight by senior leaders within the military departments, and we're seeing positive results. And I think what if I asked the military departments, I think they would agree that we need to continue down that path.
Okay, I do want to register my concern that that was not the intent of the NDAA, and that there was supposed to be envisioned one person who is responsible for the responsibilities of a director of housing, so that they were not distracted from other responsibilities. And that every single day you would have somebody wake up and their job was to make sure we took care of the oversight of privatized military housing. So I think we're going to have more conversations about that, because I'm not sure that your current structure is going to bring about the result that we all think is necessary. I'm glad to hear the progress you've made, but making sure that someone's job every day is exclusively focused on the dramatic problems that need fixing is what the intent of the law was. Moving on, I alluded to in my statement, military families really being in a situation where they don't really have much opportunity to make informed decisions about the housing that they move into. They have a right to make informed decisions about whether to move into the homes that are offered to them in privatized family housing. Are you looking at creating a publicly accessible database analogous to like a Carfax report for housing that would contain environmental health issues related to specific homes and steps taken to remedy those concerns? Because I know when I was on the ground and speaking to those families, so many of them had absolutely no idea what they were walking into. And while it's great that you have someone knock on their door 30 days later and you have surveys, making sure that people have notification of what has been wrong with the home that they are being assigned, and they have an opportunity to make an informed decision whether to occupy that home is important.
Thank you. Yeah, so we have, we're issuing the 7-year maintenance history. I think for most of the project companies, we've had, that's another one, we've asked them to do that. They did pilots. That 7-year maintenance history will then help again, empower new family members, new prospective tenants to decide whether they will lease that that house or not. So that's step one. So we are providing the military, or through the project companies, are providing the history of the homes. And I agree that we need to help these families make those decisions prior to deciding to rent a house on post or not. And so we also have the advocacy there within the housing departments. And did I lose you guys again here?
Your video is off again. No.
Okay. Yeah. So
your video is on. Mr. Kramer, I think the problem you have is that your audio is back, and so you are now on audio in both places.
Oh, okay.
But we can hear you fine.
Okay, good.
Now,
Yeah. So,
now you're getting an echo. So whatever you just did, undo that. Yeah. Keep it the way it is. We're good.
All right. Sorry about that. Yeah. Not saying that we're the world's best military department, not the world's best IT folks here. So the other part of your question, Madam Chairwoman, was the consumer advocacy website, so they can go back in and help them inform that. So we have started that process now to make an accessible website, consumer database, if you will. It's very complicated, much like I'm demonstrating here with our IT. So we've got to work through some of those complication, but we have reached out to some of the other executive branch agencies that have public-facing databases, and we're going to try to replicate that. Probably not on our NIPRNet, but we're now in that process of doing it again to help prospective residents understand what that house, conditions of the house, the history of the house. And so maintenance history, complaint histories, I think will all help the family members make an informed decision. Over.
Okay. Thank you. I appreciate that. And we're going to want to, likely you'll see language in our bill that will try to make sure that we can give you some steering directions as a result of your testimony. I know we're bouncing around a little bit, but I don't believe Ms. Lee has any additional questions. So we'll go to Mr. Case. Thank you for your questions, Mr. Gonzalez.
Thank you. Mr. Kramer, back to the actual health conditions of the service members and their families in our privatized housing. I recall, correct me if I'm wrong, I recall that the FY21 NDAA, the one we just passed, requires a DoD Inspector General to provide a report on conditions of health conditions of residents in privatized housing within 90 days. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And do you know what the status of that is? I mean, 90 days is coming up in about 5 or 6 weeks.
So within the military, within the Department of Defense, they're in what we would refer to as the data collection phase, and getting organized, and then they will then go out and do individual site visits, if you will, just to validate the data that's being collected. Over.
Related, but possibly independently. Have you actually seen, do you have data to indicate that there are any trends in terms of actual health conditions arising from, the residents of privatized housing? Is it going down, the number of complaints, or even demonstrated connections in the last, say, 4 years or so since this just really started to hit the fan?
So we've not had the opportunity to see trends, and for the most part, there's been a number of initiatives that have taken place in the last couple of years. The Army had started a health registry database, if you will, where it was open to all current residents, former residents to register in the database. So if they had health conditions, they can make those health conditions known. When they signed up in the register, they were also then linked up if there were ongoing issues with health professionals to go forward. That register has been in place for about 18 months, and there's a little over 500 families that have signed up. The other database that is ongoing is tracking displaced residents. And so if you have a home, in a lot of cases, mold is just because there's water intrusion, moisture that's not being taken care of through an HVAC. And then once you get to the point where a family does become sick or have an allergic reaction to the mold, then they're displaced. And so I would say that probably 18 months ago, it spiked in the displacements, and those are coming back down. So consistent, we've not been able to see any linkage that comes back that we can honestly say a house is causing a number of disturbances within a family, or a project in and of itself is through a lack of maintenance or lack of proper care is a pinpoint to a health issues within families. And we're still collecting data, which is what all these other initiatives are designed to do, see if we can come up with some systemic cause and effect, if you will, to the privatized housing. Over.
Okay, and let me just switch for a second here. We've talked a lot about tenant bill of rights and how some of the companies, if I understand your testimony correctly, have declined to adopt the voluntary tenant bill of rights, or actually the tenant bill of rights, I suppose, is technically, legally, at least in their view, voluntary. It begs the question to me of whether there has been adequate accountability for the private companies over the course of this this situation where these are obviously long-term leases. They're paid a certain amount. They are allowed to adjust their income for conditions. I expect in terms of what they charge through the basic allowance for housing, the BOH. I guess my concern is, have you taken a look at the question of whether they should actually be able to charge through everything? Or have they absorbed some financial consequences for perceived deficiencies in the administration of some of the privatized housing over the last couple of years, or is it just a straight pass through where they're kind of getting a free ride?
So I can say that all of the project owners have absorbed a loss, and it's not a pass through, and so their fees, if you will, are based on revenue, and so residents vote with their feet, and so occupancy, while it's still over 90%, it is down a couple of percentage points across the board, but the property managers, which is really where a lot of these issues had surfaced, and they may or may not exist to the extent today. Their fees are pinned to the property management incentive fee programs that were put into place by the military departments over the last year and a half, and then really empowered the uniformed military to grade the property management performance, if you will. As far as work orders, satisfaction, work order performance, the quality of the work, and then those are all fed back into the incentive fees. And most of the incentive fees prior to 2019 had not been looked at since the project was closed, and some of them were, quite frankly, 15, 16 years old. Not that they turned into kind of a boilerplate, but they were not measuring the things that were most important to the residents 2 years ago when this whole housing crisis came about. So now the property management incentive fees, which is owned by the military departments, then gets back into grading the performance of the property managers where past fees weren't. And so instead of a kind of a payout in the 80-90% range, some of the payouts now are down 50-60% range, and so they all are impacted by their performance. So if they're not providing the standard performance that is expected by the military departments, they are then graded accordingly on the incentive fees. Over.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Case. Okay, I'm told by Mr. Gonzalez that he doesn't have any additional questions. I have a few more, and then we'll wrap up. For Mr. Kramer and Ms. Field, the length of the MHPI agreements has been called into question. I really want to understand why we should allow the military departments to enter into 50-plus year deals with private companies. Is this a structure that has been revisited, updated, or proposed to be revised? And if it has not, should it be?
I'll take the first swing at that, and then Ms. Fields can pile on or correct me if I get this wrong. So 50 years, I think, is the right term, because remember, we're not dealing with government dollars. We're dealing with private equity funds that are borrowed by the project owners and invested back into the homes. And so in a lot of cases, the fund source is the insurance industry that wants 30 or 40-year bonds. And then so with that, you get our project companies get a lower interest rate, which in essence equates to more housing, more improvement on the housing. So if we look and reduce the term, then the project risk goes up, interest rates go up, and then you get fewer homes. So at some point, there's a sweet spot in order to borrow money and reduce your cost of that capital so that you can get more houses improved and or built new over.
Thank you, Ms. Field.
Yeah, so I mean, I think Mr. Kramer is right in the sense that there are trade-offs that come with developing agreements like this. The need for financial backing is one of them. But I think your question is really well taken because GAO has looked at public-private partnerships, this being a great example of one. And what we found when we've looked at all different types of public-private partnerships is that they really need to be structured carefully from the outset. So that we don't get into problems like we did in this case. And as the Comptroller General testified, I think a year or two ago, MHPI is sort of a classic example of where short-term decisions were made without necessarily thinking through the long-term implications. Related to that, I do have one response to Mr. Case, if you allow me, but I don't want to eat up into your time. So just very, very briefly, Congressman Case, I think your question was really well taken about the incentives that can go to the private developers for their performance or lack thereof on these projects. And you know, one of the things that we found is that the metrics that have been used to measure the performance have not necessarily always been appropriate. Mr. Kramer mentioned that residents can vote with their feet. Well, they can't always vote with their feet because some of them are required to live in privatized housing, and some of them live in privatized housing because it better meets their family's needs. They may be concerned about crime outside of the base, or they may need to use resources for families that are only available and close to privatized housing. And so we recommended that the military departments work with the private developers to change those indicators that underlie the performance metrics so that when they get incentive fees, we really know it's because of performance. And there's your catch-22. The developers have to agree to those revised metrics. And based on what we've seen in response to our recommendation, some of them have agreed to revise those indicators, but not all of them. And that is a continuing sort of work in progress. And so we'd like to see continued progress in that direction. Thank you.
So if I might, yeah. So the Department of the Air Force is still working the finer points, but within the Army and the Navy, they have each one of the project owners have adopted the new incentive fee management plans that then hold more accountability towards the property management's ability to deliver quality service. And so we did. So I know that the Army got an agreement from each one of the partners. The Navy did theirs by a MOU, if you will, where the project owners agreed to adopt it. And the Air Force is still working through the finer points of the program. Over.
Okay. I have about 18 seconds. Mr. Case, your hand is raised. Then I'll have one more question, and then we'll wrap up. Ms. Case?
Thank you. Yes, Mr. Kramer, I was going to make that comment at the end of your last answer, which was that although I understand your point on the service members having alternatives and how that impacts fees paid to the private operators in many parts of the country, and Hawaii is example number one. As a practical matter, they cannot live elsewhere because of the high cost of living, the low availability of housing, especially in the enlisted ranks. And so privatized housing becomes really a captive market from the perspective of the private companies. So I would just leave that with you, and as you consider how we can properly financially incentivize the companies to do the right thing here consistently. And I don't want to bash all companies because, the companies have been largely, I think, responsive in many, many areas, but there are gaps that we definitely need to still get at. Ms. Field, here's the big picture question. What questions do you wish we had asked you, and can you please answer them?
Oh my goodness. Well, and I guess I would identify two questions. One is, what can we do now to address the problem of some privatized housing projects being disproportionately hurt by the reduction in the basic allowance for housing. And the answer to that is that Congress needs to pass legislation that changes how the payments back to the companies to offset the effects of those reductions are calculated so that the two calculations are consistent. If we don't have that happen, then we're going to continue to have some privatized housing projects, especially those in lower cost areas, disproportionately hurt by those reductions in the basic allowance for housing. The second thing I would I guess have been interested in discussing is what can the privatized housing projects do related to climate resilience. So we have seen privatized housing projects impacted by severe weather events, hurricanes, wind and hail storms. And the department, I think, really needs to keep an eye on ensuring that the privatized housing projects are prepared for what's to come down the road. Their GAO, as you know, has identified the government's fiscal exposure due to climate change as a high-risk area. And so I think that would be an interesting area to explore moving forward. Thank you for that opportunity.
Okay, I think that
So,
does it
Mr.
for
Case,
me.
if you,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
yeah, no, that was yeah. So I want to make sure that, I want to clarify my remarks. And so while our numbers show that 2/3, 66 to 70% of the residents are in the junior enlisted. So I take your comment, to heart because they do not. The junior enlisted don't have the purchasing power that the senior folks have, and so I just want to make sure that for the record, prior to 2019, we thought in the department that the service members would vote with their feet and say, look, I'm going to go elsewhere. And we now know, when we did the analysis of who actually is renting on post, it's the junior enlisted. So that's why we really in the department have ratcheted up our oversight and are really taking this really to heart. And to the other part of that is Ms. Field's right. Is so climate climate change and weather does have a catastrophic effect on project companies in the form of insurance payments. And so all of these extreme weather events, and they're not just on the coast anymore, they're across the country, do then play into the project company's ability to provide services on their respective locations. Over.
Thank you, Mr. Kramer, and completely understood. I think we're both on the same page as to the practical realities facing our service members across the country in terms of getting housing, especially on the enlisted side. So thanks for that confirmation. I would just leave you with the thought that, as Ms. Field said, I think the big picture lesson here is how can we come up with a different incentive system in these public-private partnerships that doesn't lead us to the result where, at least in some cases, some companies are disincentivized to keep military housing up to the proper standards and not properly incentivized to do it as a financial profit motive from their perspective. And I think that's the big picture question with that Ms. Field referred to. I don't have any further questions, Madam Chair. Thanks to both of you for a very good hearing.
Thank you, Mr. Case and Ms. Field. Thank you for raising the issue that I was actually my next question about the impact of climate change and global warming, and whether we have the private companies that are appropriately preparing and building their communities with the resiliency necessary to withstand the oncoming onslaught, which we're already in the midst of. And that's something that we're going to have to continue to make sure is changed, because I don't think right now they are doing that. What I want to wrap up on is the issue of mold and lead, because one of the most commonly heard concerns I know that we heard when we were on bases, as well as in testimony, is that families are dealing with the really deleterious health effects of mold and lead on their health. What, Mr. Kramer, is being done to address these health concerns to this point, and walk us through the steps that you're taking when you go through the turnover period between occupants to prepare a new home for residents. Are you doing an environmental health audit to detect the presence of mold, radon, lead, that would seem to be an ideal time to do that and make sure that we weren't continuing and exacerbating problems that are identified.
So yeah, that is a great question. So what we realized 2 years ago was that it's a series of quality assurance, quality control, quality surveillance checks that need to take place. So at Echelon, we're doing a number of things, and so part of the move in actually starts with the move out of a prior resident. So there's a move out inspection that is done between the property manager and the current residents. You document the conditions. Those are then issues with the housing, be it HVAC issues, water intrusion issues, damage to any of the appliances. Those then are all taken care of as part of the between occupancy, if you will. And then once the property manager believes they've corrected all the deficiencies that were noted during the move-out inspections and subsequent inspections, then we conduct what is called a move-in inspection. And then so I think each one of the military departments has a check sheet that they follow to look at mechanicals, water intrusion, electric issues, yard. All of those things are part of that. They're not consistent across the Department of Defense, so we can't then say we have a uniform application, which is what I mentioned earlier, is we're defining what that uniform standard is going to be across the department, so that a resident will see the same check sheet, whether they go to an Air Force project, an Army project, or a Navy project. So that's going to be this year is standardize those processes, and so we then, when the property manager says, I'm done with the work, that's when the government staff comes in to verify. That's those housing inspectors will go in, government employees, to say whether you did or didn't, and they'll have a number of tools available to check moisture, check performance. We're trying to get those folks skilled. If not skilled, we're then develop training courses so that we have a uniform application of the move-in experience, and that way we can then correct all of those. The other issue we have with, and you had mentioned, lead and water intrusion, our legacy housing are probably the ones that are in greatest need of issues, and they also the ones where they have the most issues. And legacy we refer to as like pre-78, housing that existed prior to privatization that may have lead. Some housing, quite frankly, in areas that were built that did not have HVAC systems. They did not have air conditioning, where today the climate then will cause them to have a need for air conditioning. So we've closed up what used to be an open house, and once you close that house up, you introduce water. Water then, in and of itself, is where you come up with mold. So most of the private project owners have realized they need to increase or replace the HVAC system, so they also not just provide conditioned air, they also then remove the humidity, remove the water from the atmosphere in the housing. And so the project projects that have put in state-of-the-art mechanical systems where you're actually pulling out the humidity out of the air have seen a decrease in mildew and mold, and so that's control the humidity, control the water intrusion. You can then eliminate mold and mildew. Over.
Okay, I didn't really hear though that we are identifying in between moves that there are mold and lead radon issues, and maybe not moving someone in before those problems are mitigated.
No, yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, they are mitigated. We in the military departments will not sign off on a house until all of the issues are resolved at a project location, and some of the owners have complained about that, and so yes. The between occupancy could take a week if you meet the standard, or it could take 30 days, but they have to then work off all the deficiencies on that check sheet. Over.
Okay, we're going to hear from families as a follow-up, because that was a chief complaint that even when the companies said that they took care of it, the next family still had an issue with those potential very hazardous, infectious problems. So we want to make sure that we're staying on top of that as well. That's all the questions I have. Mr. Gonzalez, do you have any closing remarks?
No, Madam Chair, I'm good. Thank you.
Okay. Well, I appreciate the members' participation today, Ms. Field, as well as Mr. Kramer. This is an issue that we are going to continue to stay on top of, and we'll use our bill as a vehicle to make sure that we can inject some further ongoing accountability into this process, supplementing and augmenting the HVAC committee's work, which was excellent, and certainly that was, the House Armed Services Committee. I get my, I get both ends of my subcommittee a little twisted up sometimes. Supplementing the work of House Armed Services through the NDAA, because while I can appreciate many of the responses you gave us today, Mr. Kramer, there is a lot of work still to be done. And there's a lot of work that we need to have come from the companies that I think are still dragging their feet and not necessarily excited about making the changes that are really necessary to make sure that we can improve the quality of life of those folks who are living in their housing. So with that, that concludes this morning's hearing. I appreciate everyone participating. Look forward to working with you all as we craft the FY22 bill. And just as a reminder for members, our next virtual hearing is on this Friday, February 19th, 2021, with Dr. Richard Stone, Acting Undersecretary for Health, VHA, on the VA's COVID response. With that, the subcommittee is adjourned, and we'll see you on Friday. Thanks, everyone.